Welcome to my channel. Today, we revisit one of the darkest days in aviation history, a day when the sky itself seemed to turn against us, when the roar of engines was replaced by silence, and when the nation watched in disbelief as confidence in the miracle of flight shattered forever. This is not just a story about airplanes and machinery, but about people, their fear, their courage, their final words carried on the wind. It's about the day the sky went silent, and the moments that changed how America looked at the heavens. It began, like most tragedies do, on an ordinary morning. The sun rose softly over the eastern horizon, painting the clouds gold. Passengers hurried through airport terminals, rolling suitcases clicking across tile floors, their minds on meetings, vacations, loved ones waiting on the other side. Flight 722 was one of many scheduled departures that day, bound from Dallas to Chicago. A Boeing 737, reliable, modern, safe, or so everyone believed. The crew had performed hundreds of flights together, a well-oiled team. In the cockpit, Captain Ronald Everett adjusted his headset with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent half his life above the clouds. Beside him, First Officer Dana Collins reviewed checklists, her voice calm and professional. Everything about this flight felt routine. As the engines roared to life, the ground trembled. Families waved goodbye from the glass windows, watching as the plane rolled down the runway and climbed gracefully into the pale morning light. At 30,000 feet, the world below looked peaceful, rivers winding like silver ribbons, clouds floating like islands. But inside the cockpit, subtle unease began to build. A faint vibration, barely noticeable at first, pulsed through the floor. Captain Everett frowned. "You feel that?" he asked. Dana nodded. The instruments showed nothing unusual. Airspeed normal. Pressure stable. Yet the noise grew louder, like a heartbeat hidden inside the metal. They made a note of it, deciding to monitor the situation. Passengers in the cabin chatted and laughed, unaware that somewhere deep within the belly of the plane, something was beginning to fail. Back on the ground, air traffic control picked up minor inconsistencies in the flight's altitude readings. Nothing alarming, just small fluctuations. Flight 722, you're drifting slightly off level. Confirm your altitude. The captain's voice replied, steady but faintly distracted. Affirmative, correcting. A pause followed, then static. It cleared within seconds, but those seconds would soon feel eternal. The aircraft continued northward, its silver body cutting through the blue like a knife through glass. The stewardesses served coffee, and a young boy at the window pointed down at the clouds, saying they looked like waves. In a way, they were waves of air, unseen and unpredictable. 35 minutes later, a sudden jolt ripped through the cabin. Coffee cups flew, passengers gasped, and overhead compartments rattled violently. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're encountering some turbulence." But this wasn't turbulence. In the cockpit, alarms blared. One of the hydraulic systems had lost pressure. A warning light flashed red on the control panel, then another. "Hydraulics below," Dana said quickly. "Yaw damper offline." The captain's voice hardened. "We've got a control issue. Requesting immediate descent." Air traffic control acknowledged, but even as the pilots tried to stabilize, the aircraft began to behave strangely, sluggish, unresponsive. The nose dipped, then rose sharply. The autopilot disengaged with a shrill tone. Passengers clutched armrests as the plane lurched. A woman screamed as her drink splashed across her lap. The crew tried to calm everyone, but the sound of rushing wind filled the cabin. The pilots fought the controls, using every ounce of skill and strength. "We've lost elevator response," Dana shouted. "I'm trying manual trim. Nothing." Captain Everett gritted his teeth. "We're not losing this aircraft. Come on, hold together." Below them, the radar screen at Control Center flickered as the plane's altitude fell 3,000 feet in seconds. "Flight 722, you're descending rapidly. What's your status?" There was no answer. Only static, faint and broken, like a whisper through storm. For a few agonizing minutes, they managed to regain partial control. "Okay, we've got roll response back," Dana said, voice trembling slightly. "But she's heavy, very heavy." They leveled off at 20,000 feet. Passengers exhaled in relief. Some prayed quietly, others clutched hands. The captain announced that they'd be diverting to St. Louis for an emergency landing. "We're experiencing a technical issue, but everything is under control," he said. The words "under control" have never sounded so fragile. As the plane descended, the crew prepared the cabin. Flight attendants moved quickly, tightening seatbelts, locking galleys, forcing smiles they didn't feel. Outside, storm clouds gathered, black and rolling, as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. In the cockpit, the pilots coordinated with ground teams. Runway 27L was cleared, emergency vehicles in position. "We're heavy on landing weight," Captain Everett warned. "Expect brake fade." But what neither he nor anyone else knew was that the hidden fault in the hydraulic system had spread, bleeding pressure from the main gear brakes and the rudder. The plane was coming down, but not under full control. As they broke through the clouds, the city lights appeared like a scattered constellation below. The runway lay ahead, glowing faintly in rain. "Gear down," the captain said. The landing gear deployed with a deep mechanical groan. For a moment, hope returned. The ground rushed closer. "Flaps to 15, Dana commanded. "Speed steady, steady." But just before touchdown, the right gear failed to lock. The aircraft tilted, scraping the tarmac. Sparks erupted, metal screeched. The right wing struck the ground, sending the jet skidding sideways. Flames burst from the engine nacelle. Inside, passengers screamed as the cabin filled with smoke. The plane veered off the runway, tearing through the safety barrier and coming to rest in a field. Emergency crews swarmed within seconds. The night glowed orange as firefighters fought the blaze. Survivors stumbled into the wet grass, faces streaked with soot and tears. In the cockpit, Captain Everett stayed behind to help an injured flight attendant trapped in the jump seat. When rescuers reached him, he was still trying to free her, his uniform charred, his hands bleeding. The explosion that followed was heard 10 miles away. The nation watched the aftermath unfold live on television. Reporters stood under umbrellas near the smoking wreckage, their voices solemn. Officials called it a tragic accident. But when investigators examined the wreck, they discovered something unsettling: a hairline fracture in a hydraulic line that should have been replaced months earlier. It had gone unnoticed through 3 maintenance checks, slowly leaking fluid until it reached the point of failure. One oversight, one missing signature. That was all it took. The investigation changed everything. New regulations were passed. Inspections became stricter. But the scars ran deeper than paperwork could heal. Survivors spoke of nightmares, of phantom sounds, engines roaring in the dark, the smell of burning fuel in their dreams. Families mourned not just the dead, but the loss of trust in the sky itself. Airports grew quieter for a while. People looked up at planes with a different kind of reverence, mixed with fear. And yet, amid the heartbreak, there was light. Many passengers owed their lives to the heroism of the crew, men and women who refused to give up even as everything failed around them. Their calm voices, their courage, their defiance of death itself became a testament to what humanity is capable of when faced with the unthinkable. The black boxes recovered from the wreckage captured those final moments, the captain's voice saying softly, "Tell them we tried." Years later, the legacy of Flight 722 remains a warning carved into the memory of aviation, a reminder that even the smallest crack can lead to catastrophe, and that every life in the sky depends on the unseen precision of those who keep the engines of the world turning. It's a story of failure, yes, but also of sacrifice, of bravery, of people who turned terror into triumph, even if only for a fleeting moment. As the sun sets on another day of flight, we remember them, the voices that went silent, the courage that echoed louder than the wind, and the day America's confidence in the sky was tested and forever changed. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here, we bring to life the true stories of courage, mystery, and survival that shaped aviation history. Thank you for watching, and never forget, behind every flight number, there's a story written in the sky. The investigation into Flight 722 began before the fires were even out. At dawn, the wreckage lay in a field of blackened earth and twisted metal, steam rising like ghosts into the cold morning air. The smell of jet fuel mixed with rain and smoke hung over the site, clinging to the rescuers who moved slowly through the debris. The cries of survivors had faded by then, replaced by the low murmur of firefighters and investigators picking their way through what was left of a machine that had once symbolized safety and progress. A news helicopter circled overhead, its camera capturing a haunting panorama of the tragedy: charred fuselage, torn wings, seats scattered like toys. America awoke to those images, and in living rooms across the country, people stared in disbelief. How could something so advanced, so routine, end in such devastation? Within hours, the National Transportation Safety Board assembled a crash team. They sealed the site, erected tents, and began photographing every inch of wreckage. Every piece of metal told a story, and the job of the investigators was to listen. They traced burn marks, measured angles, and collected fragments of melted aluminum, searching for the faintest clue of what went wrong. The black boxes, those silent witnesses to the final moments, were found buried beneath the wreck, one scorched, one intact. They were rushed to Washington under guard, the data inside promising answers that no one else could give. But as investigators began decoding the cockpit voice recorder, they realized this was not going to be simple. There were minutes of missing audio, gaps that made no sense. The sound waves cut off mid-sentence, as if the recording had been interrupted. Some suggested it was damage from the impact. Others whispered that something had happened long before the crash. In the control tower, air traffic controllers were still shaken. The young controller who had spoken to Flight 722 in its final minutes sat in silence, staring at the radar screen that still glowed faintly green. "They just disappeared," he said quietly. "One moment they were there and the next, they were gone." He played back the transmission over and over. Static, faint words, then nothing. Investigators matched the timestamps and found that the radio cut off 3 seconds before the first hydraulic warning. It didn't fit. They sent engineers to test for electromagnetic interference, thinking maybe a power surge had disrupted communications. What they found instead were strange fluctuations in the frequency, as if another signal had bled into the channel. No one could explain it. As the news spread, families gathered at airports and hotels near the crash site, clutching photos and prayer books. Reporters crowded the lobbies, their questions sharp, their cameras relentless. Airline executives held press conferences, insisting the aircraft had been fully inspected, that the crew was highly trained, that there was no evidence of foul play. But among the investigators, a quiet tension grew. There were inconsistencies in the maintenance logs, an unsigned entry, a replaced valve that didn't match the serial number of the one listed in inventory. Small details, but small details are what bring planes down. One investigator, a veteran named Mark Spencer, refused to let it go. He had seen too many crashes blamed on pilot error that were really failures buried under paperwork. "Someone missed something," he said. "Maybe not by choice." The deeper they dug, the stranger it got. Records from the aircraft's last maintenance check showed the same hydraulic line had been flagged for inspection months earlier after a minor leak during a previous flight. It was repaired, signed off, and forgotten. But when Spencer compared the maintenance reports, he noticed the technician's signature didn't match. The handwriting was different, the initials too neat. When he called the listed technician, the man said he'd never worked on that aircraft. The report was falsified. That discovery changed everything. It meant someone, somewhere, had signed off on a dangerous plane knowing it wasn't ready to fly. But why? And who? As weeks passed, the investigation turned political. The airline's board hired attorneys who pressured the NTSB to release preliminary findings quickly. Public confidence is at stake, they said. But Spencer and his team resisted. They had found evidence of a hydraulic fluid contamination, a rare condition that caused valves to corrode and sensors to fail. It could have started weeks before the flight, slowly eating away at the system from within. When they presented the findings, an executive from the aircraft manufacturer objected, claiming that contamination of that level was impossible without sabotage. That word, sabotage, hung in the air like a curse. Reporters caught wind, and suddenly the tragedy wasn't just an accident anymore. It was a mystery. Meanwhile, survivors of the crash began to speak publicly. Their testimonies painted a terrifying picture. One passenger described hearing a metallic knocking beneath the floor moments before the first jolt. Another remembered seeing sparks near the right wing just before landing. Most haunting of all was the account of a flight attendant who survived with severe burns. She said that moments after the turbulence began, she heard Captain Everett's voice on the intercom, not calm, but strained, almost pleading. "If anyone can hear me, tell them we're fighting it." Those were his final words before silence. The public wanted answers, but the answers that came only deepened the unease. The airline insisted that their planes were safe. The manufacturer blamed poor maintenance. The union blamed corporate cost-cutting. Politicians pointed fingers at regulators who had allowed the same hydraulic systems to remain in use despite previous warnings. For the first time in years, the American public began to question whether air travel was as safe as they'd been told. Airport terminals grew quieter. Flights went half-empty. News anchors called it the fear in the skies. Behind closed doors, Spencer received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single page of internal correspondence, dated weeks before the crash. It was an email from a regional maintenance supervisor warning that several hydraulic parts were defective, but the supplier was behind schedule, and replacing them would delay operations significantly. The message ended with a chilling instruction: proceed with current components until further notice. The signature at the bottom belonged to a senior executive who later resigned citing health reasons. Spencer took the evidence to his superiors, but by then the investigation was being steered toward a conclusion of unforeseeable mechanical failure. He realized the truth was being buried. He leaked the memo anonymously to a journalist. Days later, the story hit every major news outlet. Headlines screamed of corporate negligence, falsified records, and cost-cutting that put lives at risk. Public outrage exploded. Congressional hearings were announced. Executives denied wrongdoing, but the evidence was irrefutable. The system that had failed wasn't just hydraulic, it was human. Greed, shortcuts, and silence had built the perfect storm that killed 147 people. At the memorial service weeks later, families held candles as the names of the victims were read aloud. The wind carried their voices across the field where the plane had fallen. Among the mourners stood Spencer, silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had spent his career investigating tragedies, but this one had changed him. He knew that no report, no verdict, no amount of blame could bring back what was lost. But he also knew the truth had to be told, because truth was the only thing that could keep the sky from going silent again. The cameras faded, the crowds dispersed, and life went on. But for those who had seen the wreckage, who had touched the scorched metal and heard the stories of those final moments, the sound of that silence would never leave them. The investigation might have ended on paper, but for the survivors and the families of Flight 722, it never really did. The day the sky went silent had left scars that no report could heal, and beneath the calm blue of every future flight, they could still feel it, waiting, whispering from the clouds. Months passed, but the echoes of Flight 722's fall still haunted the nation. The field where it had come down was now fenced off, a makeshift memorial of flowers and photos fluttering in the wind. Reporters no longer crowded the area, and the cameras had gone, but the grief hadn't. For families, the silence was unbearable, silence from the airline, from investigators, from the people who had promised answers. The media had moved on, but the survivors couldn't. They were trapped in the same moment, hearing the same scream of metal, the same sound of silence that came after impact. For them, time hadn't moved at all. Then one morning, a new report emerged, quietly released, almost buried in a stack of routine safety updates. It wasn't from the NTSB. It was an independent review written by an engineer who had once worked on the same model of aircraft as Flight 722. He claimed that the hydraulic failure described in the official summary didn't match what the data showed. He believed the system didn't fail because of contamination. It failed because a pressure relief valve had been intentionally disabled. He wrote that this type of modification could only be done manually, either by a technician or someone who had direct access to the maintenance bay. It was sabotage, hidden beneath technical jargon. The report was ignored publicly but quietly circulated among insiders. Spencer saw it too. It reignited the old fire in him, the sense that something bigger was at play, something no one dared to admit. He went back through the crash photos, searching for evidence. One image stood out. A section of the right wing hydraulic line torn open, but the cut was too clean, as if sliced rather than ruptured. The edges weren't jagged, they were sharp, smooth, surgical. Spencer called in a metallurgist who confirmed his suspicion. The fracture bore marks of tampering. Someone had used a tool. The problem was, no one could have reached that compartment easily without setting off alarms at the maintenance hangar. That meant whoever had done it either had clearance, or had been told to look the other way. Meanwhile, survivors were trying to rebuild their lives. Among them was Emily Sanders, a young woman who had lost her fiancé in the crash. She'd been seated near the rear and survived when the tail section broke away, saving her life by sheer luck. She suffered burns and broken ribs, but the real scars were invisible. She woke up every night to the same dream: fire, wind, screaming, then nothing. During recovery, she began keeping a journal, recording every detail she could remember. Months later, when investigators re-interviewed survivors, she mentioned something they had overlooked. Before the first jolt, she had seen a maintenance tag fluttering near the cabin bulkhead door, an inspection tag with a date that didn't match the logbook. That small observation would become the thread that unraveled everything. Spencer contacted Emily personally. Together, they compared her memory with the record. The tag she described had a maintenance date 2 weeks after the flight had supposedly been cleared. Someone had swapped components, but the wrong documentation had been attached. When he brought this to his supervisor, he was told to let it go. He didn't. He went rogue, tracking down the former head of maintenance for the airline's regional facility, a man named Richard Keene. Keene had resigned abruptly after the crash, citing stress and family issues. Spencer found him living quietly in Arizona, working odd jobs at a private airfield. At first, Keene refused to talk, but when Spencer mentioned the falsified reports, his face went pale. "You don't understand," he said. "We were told not to ground those planes. We had pressure from upstairs. If we delayed even one more aircraft, they threatened layoff. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." Under questioning, Keene admitted that he'd been aware of a potential defect in a batch of hydraulic lines supplied by a third-party contractor. They were cheaper, untested replacements. He had raised concerns, but the procurement department overruled him, saying it would cut costs and increase fleet efficiency. Keene confessed that he signed off on the parts anyway after receiving a quiet assurance from the airline's safety director that it would be handled later. It never was. That defective batch had been installed in 12 aircraft, including Flight 722. The day of the crash, Keene said, he'd tried to contact operations when he noticed the tail number on the maintenance schedule. But before he could act, the flight had already departed. His voice cracked when he said it. "I knew something would happen. I just didn't know when." Spencer recorded the interview and submitted it to the Federal Inquiry Board. But before the file could be reviewed, Keene disappeared. His phone went dead, his apartment empty. A week later, his car was found near the border, engine running, door open. No one ever saw him again. Officials ruled it a suicide, but Spencer didn't buy it. Keene wasn't running from guilt. He was running from someone else. The deeper Spencer dug, the clearer it became that Flight 722 was not just an accident of negligence, but the result of a web of greed, silence, and fear. The hydraulic failure had been a symptom. The disease was systemic. The airline released a statement calling the rumors baseless conspiracy, insisting that maintenance procedures were followed to the highest standards. Yet internally, executives scrambled to contain fallout. Emails were deleted. Contracts were quietly terminated. A new CEO was appointed to restore confidence. But no one could erase the truth entirely. Whistleblowers began contacting reporters, leaking memos about falsified inspections, missing audits, and internal warnings ignored to keep planes flying and profits rising. The public's trust in aviation, once unshakable, began to crumble. The victims' families filed a class action lawsuit. In the courtroom, photographs of the wreck were displayed, the burned fuselage reflected in the eyes of jurors who could barely look. The airline's lawyers tried to argue it was unforeseeable, a tragic chain of events no one could prevent. But when Spencer testified, his words cut through the silence. "We did know," he said. "Maybe not the day or the hour, but we knew it was coming. The cracks were there. We just refused to look at them." His testimony was a blade through the corporate armor. The settlement that followed was the largest in the airline's history, but money didn't heal the wounds. The families wanted something more precious than compensation. They wanted truth. Emily, standing outside the courthouse, told a reporter, "I used to love flying. Now I can't even look at the sky without wondering if it's safe. They told us to trust the system. But the system trusted money more than lives." Her words echoed across news broadcasts that night, a single sentence that captured what millions of Americans were starting to feel. The myth of perfect safety had been broken. For the first time in decades, air travel wasn't just a marvel of technology, it was a fragile promise, one mistake away from disaster. In the months that followed, reforms swept through the aviation industry. Old hydraulic systems were redesigned, maintenance oversight tightened, and whistleblower protections expanded. But behind those new rules was a story written in smoke and fire, one that would never fade. The memorial at the crash site became a place of quiet pilgrimage. On calm evenings, visitors said they could still hear faint echoes of engines, the whisper of flight, and the memory of the people who had trusted the sky. And somewhere in a locked archive, sealed under confidentiality agreements and corporate signatures, the true cause of Flight 722's fall still lies buried, proof that silence in the name of profit can be deadlier than any storm. The families may never see it, the public may never read it, but those who were there know the truth. The sky didn't go silent that day because the plane failed. It went silent because people did. As years slipped by, the story of Flight 722 became more than an air disaster. It became a wound stitched into America's conscience, a reminder that safety built on silence was only an illusion. The official investigation had closed, the lawsuits were settled, and public outrage had dulled into uneasy acceptance. But beneath that thin surface of closure, the truth still pulsed like a buried heartbeat. For every page of the final report stamped conclusive, there were 5 more marked classified. For every statement of accountability, there were a dozen voices silenced by legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. And for those who had lived through it, closure was a word that meant nothing. Emily Sanders, one of the survivors, could not move on. Her dreams still burned, nightmares of the cabin filling with smoke, of strangers holding hands as the world turned upside down. She couldn't fly anymore. Even the sound of jet engines in the distance made her flinch. But she could investigate. And so, years after the crash, when the world had stopped caring, she started digging again. Using connections from the family's advocacy group, she obtained fragments of maintenance data from the airline's old servers. What she found made her blood run cold. There were encrypted files, unsigned, untraceable, that contained references to something called Project Bluewing. The name appeared beside the serial numbers of the very hydraulic components that had failed on Flight 722. It wasn't a model name, not a supplier, not anything known in aviation. It was internal, secret, and deliberately hidden. She brought her findings to Mark Spencer, the former NTSB investigator who had long since retired after clashing with superiors over the case. He'd aged, his hair silver, his eyes tired, but when she said the words Project Bluewing, he froze. He went quiet for several seconds before saying softly, "I was told never to ask about that." It turned out that Bluewing wasn't an airline project, it was military. During the late 1990s, the Department of Defense had been testing adaptive hydraulic systems for unmanned aircraft, components designed to respond automatically to pressure changes. Some of those prototype systems had been tested on civilian planes under commercial partnerships, masked as cost-saving upgrade. It was an experiment meant to modernize the fleet, but it had been shelved after multiple safety concerns. Somehow, those components, or something derived from them, had found their way into Flight 722's maintenance cycle. The question was how. When Spencer and Emily tried to trace the supply chain, they hit walls everywhere. Companies listed in the paperwork didn't exist anymore. The original supplier, Aeromech Systems, had gone bankrupt 2 years after the crash, and its records destroyed in what was described as an accidental warehouse fire. The more they searched, the clearer it became. This wasn't an accident buried by incompetence, it was one buried by design. They contacted a retired engineer who had worked on the Bluewing prototype. He agreed to meet them in secret at a diner outside Seattle. His name was Joseph Albright, and his hands shook as he stirred his coffee. "I warned them," he said. "The seals weren't compatible with civilian hydraulic fluids. They'd degrade under heat and time. But someone decided it was cheaper to retrofit than replace. They thought the risks were manageable." When Emily asked if he knew which planes had been modified, Albright looked away. "I can't tell you," he said quietly. "Not because I don't want to, because I signed something that says if I do, I'll lose everything. But I can tell you this much. Your plane wasn't the first one to have trouble. It was just the first one that didn't make it home." Emily recorded the conversation and kept the file hidden, but soon after, strange things began happening. Her computer crashed repeatedly. Her phone rang at odd hours. No one spoke on the other end. One night, she came home to find her apartment door ajar. Nothing was stolen, but her documents had been moved, her drawers left open. Spencer told her to stop. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he warned. "This isn't about the airline anymore. It's about people who don't want ghosts dug up." But Emily couldn't stop. The families deserved the truth. She reached out to a journalist named Rachel Voss, known for her investigative work on government contracts. Together, they pieced together a trail of procurement documents that linked the failed parts to a defense subcontractor operating under a civilian front. That subcontractor had quietly delivered testing-grade hydraulic modules to 3 airlines as part of a cost optimization program. The program ended the same year as Flight 722's crash. When Rachel tried to contact the Department of Defense for comment, she received a brief email response. "We have no record of a project by that name." Hours later, her email account was locked, and her cloud storage deleted. The two women met Spencer again, this time in his home office. He showed them something he had kept hidden for years. A printed photograph taken from a recovered piece of Flight 722's wreckage. It showed a component with a serial number that didn't match any registered Boeing part. Someone had deliberately replaced the hydraulic module with an experimental unit. That was the final piece of the puzzle. The plane had not failed from random mechanical fatigue. It had been a test subject in a covert experiment that went catastrophically wrong. And once it fell from the sky, every trace of that experiment was erased. But when they prepared to release their findings publicly, the airline's lawyers struck first. A legal injunction silenced Rachel's publisher. Spencer received a formal letter from the Department of Transportation warning him that disclosing classified material relating to aviation defense research could result in prosecution. Emily's advocacy group was audited, their funding frozen. It was a warning, clear and unmistakable: stop digging or be buried with the truth. Still, word leaked. Anonymous sources began feeding small details to independent journalists. Phrases like experimental technology, unauthorized modifications, and cover-up began appearing in online forums and alternative news channels. At first, the mainstream media dismissed them as conspiracy theories, but when one leaked document surfaced, a maintenance invoice listing Blue Wing components shipped under a testing waiver, the narrative changed overnight. The story made national headlines again. Senate committees demanded new hearings. Airline executives were subpoenaed. The Department of Defense issued its usual denial, but insiders started talking off the record. They said Blue Wing had been a real program, but not for flight safety. It was for autonomous control. The goal had been to design aircraft that could be remotely stabilized in case of pilot incapacitation. The system used adaptive hydraulic channels that responded to external signals, but it had never been approved for passenger use. Somehow, it found its way onto Flight 722. The hearings were chaotic. Families packed the courtroom, their faces filled with a rage that had been simmering for years. Spencer testified again, this time openly accusing both the airline and government agencies of criminal negligence. They tested technology on human lives, he said. They gambled with the safety of civilians in the name of progress. And when it failed, they erased it. The room fell silent. Across the aisle, the executives stared ahead, expressionless. When the hearings ended, the public demanded accountability, but only scapegoats were offered, mid-level managers fired, committees reshuffled, promises of transparency made but never fulfilled. Afterward, Emily stood outside the courthouse, exhausted but unbroken. Reporters surrounded her, shouting questions, but she said only one thing before walking away: the truth is still in that field. And she was right. Despite all the documents, all the testimony, the real story remained buried beneath layers of secrecy and soil. The remains of the aircraft still sat in a locked hangar, guarded, its wreckage sealed under federal custody. Whatever data those twisted pieces of metal still held, whatever proof of tampering, of forbidden technology, was trapped in silence. Years later, when the families gathered for the 20th anniversary, Emily spoke at the memorial. Her voice trembled but carried across the wind. "They told us the sky is safe now," she said, "but safety without honesty is an illusion. The truth fell with that plane, and until it's found, the sky will never be silent again. It will always whisper what really happened." That night, as candles flickered across the field, a gentle wind swept through the grass. For a moment it sounded almost like distant engines, faint, rhythmic, and mournful. Some said it was their imagination. Others said it was the souls of the passengers, still circling above, waiting for someone to finally listen. Whatever it was, it carried the same message the nation had ignored for too long: that silence, no matter how deep, can never truly bury the truth. The following spring brought new storms, not in the sky but in the halls of power. After the Blue Wing revelations, the public demanded justice, but justice moves slowly when it threatens the powerful. Congressional committees formed, subpoenas were issued, and television anchors spoke of accountability with rehearsed outrage. Yet, behind the camera lights, phone calls were being made, quiet ones between the very agencies accused of negligence. A deal was in motion, one that would protect reputations and bury evidence deeper than any wreckage. But not everyone was willing to let that happen. Mark Spencer knew this playbook too well. He'd seen truth bent and buried before, seen lives traded for political peace. Now retired, he spent his days cataloging everything he still had on Flight 722, the interviews, photos, transcripts, and personal notes from witnesses who'd trusted him. He knew they'd try to erase history again, so he decided to fight in his own way. He began writing a book, a meticulous record of everything the official reports left out. He called it The Day the Sky Went Silent. But before he could finish, his home office was broken into. His computer vanished. So did his external drives. His handwritten files, stored in a locked cabinet, were untouched, as if whoever came knew exactly what to take. He reported it, but the police found nothing. Probably a burglary, they said. But Spencer wasn't fooled. He'd seen the same kind of burglary at government offices during investigations years ago. Someone wanted his work gone. Meanwhile, Emily Sanders refused to give up. Despite the warnings, she and journalist Rachel Voss pushed forward with an independent documentary. They wanted to show the public the full story, the negligence, the cover-up, the human cost. They visited survivors, mechanics, and former air traffic controllers, gathering every sliver of truth that could still be spoken. The interviews were raw. Some broke down on camera. One mechanic confessed that after the crash, he'd been ordered to destroy maintenance records related to the Blue Wing program. "I kept a few pages," he said, sliding an envelope across the table. "I couldn't sleep knowing it was all gone." Inside were copies of handwritten notes and shipping receipts, stamped with the logo of the now-defunct Aeromex Systems. The dates matched the maintenance cycle of Flight 722. It was proof that those components weren't supposed to be there, and that someone had intentionally put them there anyway. Rachel wanted to release the footage immediately, but Emily hesitated. "If we move too fast, they'll shut us down before it airs," she said. They planned to release it anonymously online, under a neutral name, timed to coincide with the next memorial anniversary. But word of their work must have leaked. One night, while editing in her apartment, Rachel's screen flickered. A black message appeared for a moment before vanishing. "Stop now." She thought it was a virus, until the lights went out and she heard footsteps in the hallway. She grabbed her laptop and ran. The next morning, she was gone. Her car was found 2 days later near a marina, her keys still in the ignition. Police called it a disappearance with no signs of foul play. But Emily knew. The footage was gone, the backups deleted. And just like that, another truth vanished. The nation's attention shifted again as another tragedy filled the headlines. The Flight 722 case faded, mentioned only in documentaries and internet forums. But under that silence, more whispers grew. Another aircraft, a cargo plane retrofitted with the same hydraulic modules, had experienced a near-fatal failure over Alaska. It barely landed, but the pilot's report matched the same symptoms: unresponsive controls, sudden loss of hydraulics, partial recovery. This time, however, the evidence couldn't be hidden. The airline was smaller, independent, and not under military contracts. When investigators inspected the wreckage, they found the same blue-stamped valves marked experimental, not for commercial use. The revelation reignited public fury. Under mounting pressure, the FAA reopened its investigation into Blue Wing. Spencer was called back as an advisor, though unofficially. No pay, no title, just his expertise. He worked quietly, wary of everyone. Many of his former colleagues had retired or moved on, but he recognized the pattern. "They're pretending to fix it," he told Emily. "They'll rewrite history again, call it an isolated case, and move on." But this time, he was determined to stop them. The turning point came from an unexpected source, a whistleblower inside the Department of Defense. He contacted Emily through encrypted channels, identifying himself only as Lancer. His message was simple: "I have documents proving Blue Wing was active long after they said it ended. Meet me. Don't tell anyone." Emily was terrified, but she agreed. They met at a train station cafe late one night. The man was in his 50s, wearing a worn coat, his eyes darting nervously. He slid a flash drive across the table. "These are copies," he said. "Emails, purchase orders, test logs." They continued installing the system on select aircraft even after the crash. They said it was for research. They lied. Emily asked why he was giving it to her. "Because I worked on it," he said quietly. "And I can't live with it anymore." Then he stood and left, disappearing into the crowd before she could even ask his name. When she opened the files, her hands trembled. They contained communications between defense contractors, engineers, and government liaisons, all referencing Blue Wing adaptive trials. The logs described attempts to override hydraulic control remotely through satellite-linked signals. One line made her blood run cold: civilian integration successful. Further results classified. It was proof beyond doubt. Flight 722 had been part of a secret experiment, one that continued for years after the crash, hidden under new names. She called Spencer immediately, but when he answered, his voice was weak, slurred. He'd had a heart attack. By the time she reached the hospital, he was gone. His family said the stress had finally caught up to him, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had happened. 2 days later, his house burned down in what officials called an electrical fault. All his papers, his drafts, his notes, gone. Everything he'd kept to tell the world the truth was reduced to ash. Emily vanished from the public eye for months after that. She moved frequently, using aliases, fearful of being followed. But she still had the flash drive. She uploaded the files in secret to an offshore server, hidden behind layers of encryption, and left instructions in her will to release them automatically if anything happened to her. Then, on the 20th anniversary of the disaster, she reappeared online with a recorded statement. Her face was older, lined with fatigue, but her voice was steady. "They said Flight 722 was an accident," she said into the camera. "They said it was a malfunction, a system failure, bad luck. But it wasn't luck. It was greed, ambition, and fear. They tested technology on civilians without their consent, and when it killed people, they buried it. I've seen the documents. I've heard the lies. I'm done being silent. The truth is coming." The video spread like wildfire, shared millions of times before being taken down by court orders. But the damage was done. The files were already mirrored across hundreds of servers, impossible to erase. Independent journalists verified the metadata, confirming their authenticity. Suddenly, the whispers became headlines again. Congressional hearings reopened, this time with new evidence that could not be denied. The names of officials and contractors involved were revealed. Some resigned, others vanished. The program's existence was finally acknowledged, though under a sanitized label, an early test of remote stability technology. But the confession came too late. Trust was gone. People demanded more than explanations. They wanted accountability. The government issued apologies, the airlines distanced themselves, and once again, the story of Flight 722 filled the airwaves. Yet, beneath the noise, there was only sorrow. Spencer was gone. Rachel was gone. Dozens of others who had tried to speak had paid with their lives or their peace. Emily had survived, but barely. That year, the memorial field was visited by thousands. Flowers, letters, and small model planes covered the ground. At dusk, as the crowd held candles, Emily stood before them and spoke one last time. "They silenced the sky once," she said, her voice breaking. "But they can't silence memory. Flight 722 is no longer just a tragedy, it's a warning. The truth always finds its way back through the smoke." The crowd fell silent, their candles flickering in the evening wind. Somewhere above, a distant aircraft passed, its engines humming softly, a reminder that the sky, even after all it had taken, still belonged to those brave enough to look up. But for those who remembered that day, the sound of flight would never again be just a sound, it would always carry the echo of the moment when the sky went silent, The world moved on, but the scars of Flight 722 never healed. Its wreckage had been cleared, the investigations closed, and the headlines faded into the archives, but the silence it left behind was deafening. Even as new planes filled the skies, there lingered a quiet distrust, a shadow that stretched across every takeoff, every landing, every parent who gripped an armrest just a little tighter. The crash had changed something fundamental, not just in aviation, but in faith. Faith in technology, faith in systems, faith in the idea that the people in charge would always tell the truth. 25 years after the tragedy, a cold front swept across the Midwest. On that anniversary morning, a handful of families gathered at the memorial field. The wind carried the sound of church bells from a nearby town, their slow toll echoing through the empty landscape. Emily Sanders stood before the granite monument, now weathered by rain and time. Her hair was gray now, her hands unsteady, but her eyes were clear, steel blue, defiant, unbroken. Around her, children of the victims laid flowers at the base, whispering names they had never had the chance to know. She had come every year, but this time was different. She was waiting for someone. A young man approached, carrying a small box. His name was Daniel Keene, the son of the maintenance chief who had vanished decades earlier. He had never spoken publicly before, but when he looked at Emily, there was recognition, as if their shared pain had always connected them. "My father wasn't guilty," he said quietly. "He tried to stop it. He left something for you." He opened the box. Inside was an old metal key, tarnished but still intact. A tag hung from it with one word. Engraved. Hangar 32. Emily's heart pounded. She knew that hangar. It was part of an old decommissioned maintenance base owned by the airline before it was sold to a private contractor. Officially, it had been sealed after the investigation, its contents transferred elsewhere. But what if it hadn't been? That night, Daniel drove her there. The air smelled of rust and rain. They pried open the door, the hinges groaning like an old memory resisting the light. Inside, rows of covered machinery sat under decades of dust. And in the center, wrapped in plastic sheeting and surrounded by forgotten crates, was a familiar shape, the twisted fuselage section of Flight 722. Emily froze. For years, she had been told the wreckage had been destroyed after analysis. Yet here it was, preserved like a relic of a lie. Together they tore away the coverings, revealing serial numbers, wiring, and the hydraulic assembly that had been at the heart of every theory. She knelt beside it, brushing her hand over the corroded metal. Something caught her eye, a small panel welded over another, the seams uneven, sloppy. Daniel found a crowbar and pried it open. Inside was a rectangular black unit about the size of a book, its label faded but still legible, Blue Wing Adaptive Control Node Prototype 05. For a long time neither of them spoke. The evidence that so many had died for was right there, silent but undeniable. Emily turned the device over and found a serial marking that matched one from the whistleblower's files. "They left it here," she whispered. "They wanted it gone, but they didn't destroy it. They hid it." She pulled out her phone, filming every angle, every mark. Then they heard it. A vehicle outside, headlights cutting through the broken windows. Daniel quickly turned off the light. Voices echoed from the entrance. Two men, flashlights sweeping through the dust. "They're here," one said. Emily's pulse raced. They hid behind a crate, holding their breath as beams of light passed inches from their faces. One man stopped near the fuselage, muttering, "They got in. Check the unit." The other replied, "It doesn't matter. We're scrapping this whole place tomorrow. Orders from above." The words struck her like ice. If they left now, it would all be gone forever. When the men finally left, Emily knew there was no time to waste. With Daniel's help, she pulled the device free and wrapped it in her coat. They slipped into the night unnoticed, the rain washing away their footprints. Back home, she contacted one of the few people she still trusted, a retired engineer who now ran an independent safety lab. When he opened the device days later, what he found stunned him. Inside were circuit boards etched with microprocessors decades ahead of their time, technology that shouldn't have existed then. Embedded in the chip was a data port, encrypted, containing logs of flight telemetry and signal transmissions. The timestamps matched the night of the crash. Even more shocking, the data showed external input, a remote command sent to the system seconds before the hydraulic failure. It wasn't mechanical fatigue. It wasn't pilot error. The aircraft had received an unauthorized signal that changed its hydraulic configuration. Someone on the ground had accessed the plane's control system. Emily sat in silence as the engineer read the findings aloud. "This proves it," he said. "They weren't just testing new tech. They were controlling it." The revelation was devastating, but it also meant something else. Flight 722 hadn't simply fallen victim to negligence, it had been part of an experiment that crossed every line of ethics imaginable. And those responsible had gotten away with it for a quarter of a century. With Daniel's help, she contacted a network of independent journalists and whistleblower advocates. The evidence spread faster than any court order could stop it. This time, there would be no silencing, no deletion, no technical failures. The footage of the Blue Wing device appeared on every major news platform, sparking outrage across the nation. The government scrambled to contain the fallout, but the truth was out. Investigations reopened worldwide into other unexplained air incidents from the same decade. Patterns emerged. Minor anomalies dismissed as turbulence, signals that didn't belong, failures that had the same digital fingerprint. Flight 722 had been the first, but not the last. Congress launched a new inquiry, this one public and televised. When Emily was called to testify, she spoke with quiet conviction. "For 25 years," she said, "we were told that silence was safety. But silence is what killed them. The truth was never meant to protect the public. It was meant to protect those who lied. I've spent my life chasing ghosts, but today, the ghosts finally have a voice." The chamber was silent except for the clicking of cameras. The chair of the committee promised full transparency, but Emily had learned not to trust promises. Still, as she stepped outside into the daylight, something felt different. For the first time, the weight she'd carried for decades began to lift. In the months that followed, the Blue Wing program was officially exposed. Declassified reports confirmed everything: unauthorized testing on civilian aircraft, falsified maintenance records, and the deliberate destruction of evidence. Several high-ranking officials resigned. The airline dissolved completely. Laws were passed ensuring that experimental defense technology could never again be installed on civilian planes without full disclosure. For the public, it was a victory. For Emily and the families, it was a bittersweet end, justice that had come far too late. On the 30th anniversary, a new memorial was unveiled at the site of the crash. This time it wasn't just a stone monument, it was a sculpture of wings rising from the earth, forged from metal recovered from the wreck itself. At the base was an inscription chosen by Emily: "Truth is the only thing that keeps the sky from falling." That evening, as the sun set behind the horizon, the crowd held candles, their reflections shimmering on the steel wings. Emily stood apart, watching the sky turn red and gold. She could almost hear the faint hum of engines above, a sound that once filled her with fear but now brought a strange peace. She knew that the people who had died on Flight 722 were not forgotten, they had become part of something larger, something unbreakable. Their story had changed the world. She closed her eyes and whispered to the wind, "You can rest now." For the first time in decades, the air around her felt still, not heavy with grief, not echoing with questions, but calm. The sky was silent again, yes, but this time it was the silence of peace, not of suppression. The truth had finally flown free. If this story moved you, if you believe that remembering matters, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here we honor the courage, mystery, and resilience behind every flight that carried hope and heartbreak across the skies. Thank you for listening, and never forget the lesson of Flight 722. Even when the engines fail and the world goes quiet, the truth will always find its way home.